Castle Saturday. The Castle Saturdays are occasional events in which we showcase and celebrate all the brilliant ongoing work that's been done by my colleagues in English literature at Lancaster University. I'm Michael Greeny, and I'm very pleased and proud to be able to introduce two of my estimable colleagues and two of our brilliant PhD students who are going to be speaking about current research here in the castle. I was thinking about castles this morning. I was thinking about castles in literature are not always very inviting places. You go to a castle in a literary text, chances are there's going to be a ghost or a vampire or a bloodthirsty aristocrat waiting for you in that castle. Or if you get to Kafka, it's even worse. There will be bureaucrats, the worst monsters of all. But we're still captivated by them. There's something about the castle that captivates the literary imagination. We're going to be captivated today by talks from Dr. Clare Egan and Dr. Kwazu Tembo. We're celebrating books by colleagues, which is always a very exciting thing to do. I always like basking in the reflected glory of the achievements of my colleagues. So Claire will be talking about her book on Libel in Jacobean England in conversation with Rebecca Halliwell, brilliant PhD student. And then we're going to have a break. We're sort of going to play it by ear. We'll perhaps have 30 or 40 minutes for lunch, but we'll let that kind of talk and conversation run its course. We'll have a break for lunch, and then we'll hear from Kwazu about his new book on time travel in contemporary cinema. He'll be in conversation with the equally brilliant Louise Gorse. Practicalities, the toilet's just there in the corner, and there are other toilets just by the cafe there. It's a very good cafe. I don't work for that cafe, but I can recommend it as a fine purveyor of coffee and cake and so forth. And also, if you need to come and go during the day, this isn't like a Gothic castle. The doors are not locked, so don't. If you need to melt away or stretch your legs, that's absolutely fine. So I think I can now say the immortal words without further ado. I will hand over to Claire and in due course to Becky.
John and Kwazu, Rebecca and Louise for being here. Thanks everybody for coming, especially on a Saturday. It's really nice to see you all. So I'm just going to give you a bit of an idea of what I'm going to be talking about for the next kind of maybe half an hour or so. I'm going to cover this topic in 3 parts, not all equal. The first part is a bit longer, so don't worry. I'm going to first of all kind of introduce you to what libel is, because that's one of the most common questions I get asked. It's not maybe something that we're that familiar with now, but trust me, it was a really big problem in Jacobean England. I'm going to do a little bit of information on the legal side of things, but don't worry, it's not going to get too kind of law heavy. But just a little bit of an overview of why the legality of writing matters at this period. And then I'm going to think a little bit about the temporality of the libels that I study, kind of thinking around the themes of the day of time and castle and those things. For me, early modern libels, they're a very interesting kind of double form in that they reflect really long-standing medieval cultures of insult, but they also are a very topical early modern kind of distinctive form because they're quite multimedia and they take part in emerging print landscapes in really interesting ways. So, it is safe to say that early modern England, by which I mean around the 1590s up to about the 1630s, had a libel problem. In scholarship, it has been called an epidemic of libel. It's also been called a phenomenon of the age. So I thought I would start with a little bit of commentary from the period on the problem of libel. This is an epigram by the aptly named satirist Thomas Bastard, who was a satirist, wrote a kind of well-known series of epigrams. One of his epigrams was about libel itself, so I'll read it to you. Libel, all raw with indigested spite, whose wit doth drop envenomed injury, whose pen leaks blots of spiteful infamy, which the sink of thy paper doth recite. Why dost thou boast? For if thou hadst done well, in naughty things 'twere easy to excel. Okay, so a couple of things that strike me about this epigram. Note that it's addressed to libel, not the libeller. So not the person who is writing the libel, but the libel itself, the text. Libeling is also seen here as indigested spite, so raw insult, not dressed up in any kind of poetic or civil nicety, but raw and undigested, and envenomed. So this is the really nasty stuff. Also notice the line, the sink of thy paper doth recite. So again, we've got this kind of anonymous source. It's the libel is coming from the paper, but it also is recited, and which gives us a kind of suggestion of what interests me particularly about these texts, in that they are often written in various different forms, but they also always are read aloud or performed in lots of different ways. So they have this interesting kind of double life as text and as performance material. Those last two lines kind of equate to the writer saying to the libel, why do you boast as if you had done something good or well? When in fact it's very easy to do naughty things effectively. And this is the writer trying to distinguish libeling from his genre, the satire. So satire was a really popular mode for the period of writing, but crucially, satire done well aims to remedy through shame the sin and not the sinner. So it's aiming at the social problem instead of the person who is being attributed with that social problem. And this poem is trying to distinguish that kind of satirical mode as an art from what he sees as libeling. It's easy to be insulting in public, is what he's saying. So this gives us, I hope, a bit of an idea of what libel in this period was. It's insult in its rawest form, public humiliation of a particular, often named target, and it took lots of different forms. So it's often written in verse or in song and sung in public. They also wrote libels as plays, and it also included the practice of impersonating somebody in public. There are also libels that engage with visual symbols. So one of the most common symbols for the period is a pair of horns that suggests cuckoldry. That's a really common sign in libels. Other ones, more disturbingly, I found constructed mini gallows that they kind of put at people's gates, a little bit more hauntingly for our castle setting. And all of these forms were connected to public performance. So the verse read aloud in public, a play performed in public, the text posted up on the walls of public places like marketplaces, and those symbols or signs, also sometimes caricatures. I've seen caricatures of people, targets who were named as the devil, kind of drawn as a caricature, posted up in public. And the other thing just to note, kind of as an introduction to this type of form, in modern law we separate libel and slander in that libel is written and slander is spoken. That is not established for this period of time. So that hybridity of form that involves both written and spoken is covered by libel in its form that I'm going to be talking about today. So this form is kind of not poetic satire done for the greater good of society, and it's also not just name calling in the street. It's kind of somewhere in the middle, name calling, but with a creative license that makes it much more powerful and dangerous. In some senses, and I've written a little bit elsewhere about this, it's seen as the social media of its day. Okay, that's kind of one of the parallels. So, my research often leads people to ask, what's the best insult you've come across? I'm sure you're familiar with the kind of Shakespearean insult generator type thing. Libels are much better. Shakespeare doesn't even come close to some of the insults that the legal cases recording libels cover. So I often get asked what's the best insult from the period. I can't do the rude ones here. Some of them are awful. If you want to, I have an appendix of them in the book. Some of them are terrible, and I'm not going to cover those today because I can't say them in public, they're so bad. But one of my kind of favourite, or I guess most striking examples is what I'm going to start with. So this legal case, comes from a dispute in the East Midlands in 1608 over enclosure. So enclosure was an issue of major conflict in the early modern period, where common land that had previously been open to all was fenced in or privatised by wealthy landowners so that they could make more money from it by farming sheep and cattle. And it caused uproar, it caused riots and rebellion, mostly by people of poor or lower status, rebelling against the privatisation and enclosure of land. In the case of Goodrich versus Burton, the enclosers in the local area, so the landowners who had put up fences and hedges to enclose their fields so that the masses could not kind of draw on their resources as common land, were libelled by a group of local men in a verse, which they read aloud to crowds who had gathered in a local shop. Part of that libel went like this: "Rough spaniel-faced Harold, that greedy gaping lout, most like a filthy hedgehog doth creep and run about, into all hedged corners and never was contented. His pricks and bristles now are cut, and so his race prevented." The verse is much longer than this. This is just a small excerpt. And it's written in the form of a letter signed off by the pseudonym, your good friend Thomas Unhedge-all. So this is one of my favourites. It's memorable. I love hedgehog as an insult. It just never would occur to me to use that as an insult, but I think it works really well here. Part of what I think is memorable about this is that insult is really clever in that it's the fences and hedges that is what the kind of target is doing as a social wrong. And the protesters in the local area had, in fact, as part of their kind of riotous rebellions, had taken down some of the newly erected fences and hedges to try and protest against enclosure. So that line about the fences, his pricks and bristles all being cut, and the idea that he can't now go into hedged corners reflects the kind of social protest actions that were happening in the locality. And that pseudonym, Unhedge-all, is a really interesting one. It plays on the hedging and unhedging. So this verse is seen as playing a kind of moral role in opening up the enclosed land again from a kind of collective voice, given this, I think, quite clever pseudonym. So the libel is positioning itself as a remedy to enclosure in that sense. Okay, and you'll have noticed, hopefully already, that these aren't just written documents, they are publicly communicated. They are acted or read. So one really specific example of this is a famous, or infamous even at the time, case from Wells in Somerset, which took place in 1607 or 8. So the libellers in this case were targeting the local authorities, so the constables and the justices of the peace, who were kind of figures of ridicule because they had Puritan views and they were very strictly enforcing them on the locality. The libels took the form of libelous May Day pageants. So the city had its lovely kind of May Day celebration in which pageants of civic celebration kind of paraded through the town. And the libelers constructed a follow-on set of pageants which impersonated the local constables and justices in ridiculous fashion. They had them riding backwards on horses and saying ridiculous things, and they paraded them through the city. There were also 2 verses written about this occurrence that kind of relived the libelous pageants. They also made a game which they kind of used. So the principal target was called Mr. Hole, and they made a holing game about him, which they took around the city and played with a caricature of him written on it. One of the depositions of witnesses who saw this happen in the case testified that they had seen one of the verses read aloud by one of the libelers, which speech he delivered with the action of his foot and hand much like a player, which moved this deponent to think that the verses had been part of some play. So not only are these written texts, but they come alive in their communal publication. And this is where I have found that libel case records, these legal records, give us a kind of mine of previously untapped evidence of performance and its interpretation by people watching, which we don't often get for the period, that goes way beyond the London playhouses of the kind of Shakespearean stage into a kind of everyday type of performance and reception. So you'll notice that this is a deposition. Not only do we get bills of complaint that outline what happened in the cases, they also have to include the words or a copy of the libel itself. And we then also have answers from the defendants who are being accused. We also have lists of interrogation questions that the court posed to witnesses and those involved in the case. And we have examination booklets that match up with those interrogation questions, so we can see what the people involved in the case have testified. So we get loads of different types of evidence of performance. These libels were also not just kind of verse that reminded somebody of seeing a play, but they also were embedded in plays themselves. So to give you a local example here from Kendal, and performed in a castle, possibly much like the one we're in. This case saw a group of local tenants libeling their landlords. So sorry if anyone in the room is a landlord, but some sources of social contention don't change, ever. So this example comes from 1621, where the tenants did publicly act a stage play at Kendal Castle, and did therein make a representation of hell, and in the same did personate and act many lords of the manors of the said county, which they did libelously and disgracefully represent to be in hell, to the great abuse of the lords. So more specifically, we hear in these case records that 2 fool or clown characters walk on stage and they bring a boy actor with them. They ask the boy what he sees in the representation of hell on the stage. The boy reports back to the clowns, and the clowns then report to the audience that the boy has seen landlords, Puritans, sheriffs, and bailiffs in hell. So this kind of case, I love it. It shows that some things never change. But it also shows the important role that drama, and I guess libelous drama, could play in social protests. These were tenants protesting about the practices of their kind of landlords. Just like the enclosure case, the tenants are looking for social reform by publicly shaming the people that kind of have power, hold power over them. And when I say there's a wealth of information, here's what the records actually look like. it can be kind of daunting when you pull them out of the box, and they are all kind of, you can see it on this one, they're all attached in the corner here, but they're all different sizes and shapes, and so you have to unfold them. They're on vellum, so they're very stiff. And then you have to make sense of the handwriting. This one is a record of an examination, so the legal clerk will be interrogating a witness and taking notes at the same time. So they look slightly different to the fair copies, which are like this. But they give us a really interesting kind of draft stage. So they are a kind of report of the verbal testimony in a really interesting way. But for that reason, they are also terrible to transcribe because they're just notes. Quite a lot of them have crossed out bits. If you can read the crossed out bits, that's my favourite. I think that's the most telling thing. But sometimes you can't make it out. Okay, so these archives give us, because they involve lots of different people's perspectives on the same event, they give us a wealth of information. A quirk of the court that they are being tried in, which is called the Star Chamber, is that most of the outcomes of the cases are lost. The outcomes books, I think, are said to have been destroyed by fire at some point. So when I first started studying these, I found that really frustrating because you don't know what the outcome was. In a lot of cases, you do in the more high-profile one, but in some of the kind of lesser-known cases, we've no idea what whose side the court came down on. But I've come to think of that as actually quite productive because it means you have to take the narratives that each different person's perspective is giving you more seriously. If you don't already have a prejudged idea of the outcome of the case, you can think differently of the different perspectives that those records are giving you. And I've also, on a kind of temporal reflection, I've always found it quite odd that by making a legal complaint, the target of these libels has preserved the libels for posterity so that now we can read them, when actually, if they hadn't, there would be no way of knowing that this kind of horrible stuff was written about them. Why then, that kind of raises the question for me, why do it? Why commit these kinds of things to a legal record? I think the answer to that is that the Star Chamber cases, the legal cases themselves, were an equally performed way to restore your reputation, to counter the initial performance of the libel itself. They reframed that kind of damaging communal performance of libel in a central court of law, where the reception of the material was really tightly controlled. So at the Star Chamber, by comparison to other courts of the day, laughter was not allowed. So if the bill of complaint is read out loud with the libel in it, the audience reception reaction is denied. You're not allowed to laugh at it in that context. It's reframed as a kind of criminal act. And in the Star Chamber, the defendants are also summoned to appear in person, so they have to be present while the case is happening, which means that they are made an example of. The Star Chamber itself is also really, really aware of its position and its role as a kind of exemplary court. So it's a central Westminster court, and it is one of the most high-profile monarch's prerogative courts. The judges in the Star Chamber are members of the Privy Council, so this is kind of the top legal forum of its day. It also was open to the public, so you could go and watch the trials happening. There are records that suggest gentlemen would pay people to go and reserve a good seat for them so that they could be front and centre for what was happening in Star Chamber that day. They controlled the reception. It was an austere court. There was no kind of foul-mouthed or laughter allowed. There was also a gentleman who wrote a letter to his son saying you would be better off going to the Star Chamber than you would to the Globe Theatre in order to learn your part in life better. So it has a kind of exemplary performative role in itself. In terms of their punishments, they also play on the performance side of things. So the most common punishments for libel cases are big fines, coupled with public apologies that happen at the Westminster Court and in the localities where the crime took place, so that you have to publicly apologise to the people that you might have performed the libel in front of. Itself a kind of act of public shaming. But they also were a little bit more creative sometimes. So there's one verse in which the refrain, so the verses say nice things about the people that they're targeting, and then the refrain is the clean contrary way. So everything I've said is the opposite. The punishment that the Star Chamber dealt out in that case was that they had to ride backwards on horses to mirror their kind of subversive song. So they know the performative elements of their punishments. Sometimes people were also made to appear in the pillory, and appear in the pillory wearing papers, so wearing the libel stuck to their head as a shaming kind of mechanism. Those things I think all seem fairly trivial. In their most extreme, some of the punishments were that you would have your ears cut or your nose slit, so it did get pretty awful as well. But yeah, the court itself knows the role of performance. So even though I think the person libelled has kind of oddly, ironically preserved the libel against them for posterity, they also played an important role. And I think we can see this. So I spent one interesting day going around the localities of where some of my libel cases happened. This is the really small rural parish church of Hittersley in Devon, near Dartmoor. It's kind of in the middle of absolutely nowhere. But one of my cases involved a libel against John Poulton, the parson of Hittersley, so the parson of this little church that still exists. And what couldn't have been better is this stone on the floor here, massive, so kind of bigger than the altar itself, is Poulton's gravestone. So he has left a record of his humiliation. The libel that happened to him was that the libellers hauled him out of church while he was delivering divine service and shamingly marched him all the way to jail in Oakhampton, about 8 miles away, while he was still wearing his robes. So that record still exists in the archives in Kew, but I think there's also a kind of nice justice in that his gravestone, his status marker, is still in his locality to kind of preserve his reputation untarnished. Okay. So I said I'm gonna just do a little bit of time on the legal specifics of things. So far I've emphasised the performance nature of these libels, and now I want to explain my focus on what I call, or what scholars call, private libel. So the libelling of individuals, not those holding public or government office. So before the 1590s, it was a moral offence, so a sin, to defame an individual who didn't hold public office. So just a kind of normal private person. And this offence was dealt with by church courts. Under this ruling, we excommunicate all those who, for the sake of hatred, profit or favour, or for whatever other cause, maliciously impute a crime, so a sin, to any person who is not of ill fame among good and substantial persons. So before the 1590s, if you were insulting publicly an individual who didn't hold public office, you would be hauled in front of the church courts on a moral offence, and the punishment for that was public apology or penance in church, and at its most extreme, excommunication, so being officially excluded from church services. Whereas it was a criminal offence before the 1590s to defame the monarch or the magnates, people in public office. Under the law of Scandalum Magnatum, which is a statute from 1275, from henceforth none be so hardy as to tell or publish any false news or tales, whereby discord or matter of discord or slander may grow between the king and his people or the great men of the realm. So in this criminal offence, false news was seen as leading to the destruction of the kingdom, and it was punishable by death as sedition. But in the 1590s, private libel that had previously been tried as a moral offence in church courts was redefined and criminalised and could then be tried at the Court of Star Chamber. So after that change, the private libels, so rude verses written just against your neighbour in a small rural Devon village, could be tried at the same Westminster court alongside nationally significant political matters of false news. That, I think, is a really significant shift. It's perhaps not that such libels about private individuals were not being written before the 1590s, but they weren't being preserved in the same way because they weren't treated legally in the same kind of seriousness and criminality. And this leads to some interesting legal principles or kind of new legal precedents being set by the Star Chamber. The Star Chamber's involvement in libel arose from its jurisdiction over breaches of the common peace. So it could have jurisdiction over any kind of conflicts that threatened common peace or the kind of settled commonwealth. That meant that in the case of libels, they could say that the truth didn't matter anymore. It doesn't matter if the libel is true or false. That's not what they're interested in. One of the principal barristers of the court, William Hudson, who also authored a very handy treatise, which is our main source of information for what happens there, said that a true libel was in fact more likely to cause a breach of the peace than a false one was, because, and I'm quoting, "a woman should never grieve to be told of her red nose if she had not one indeed." So the truth of the libel or the falsity of it, of the content, was no longer a defence, meaning that Hudson could say, for the Star Chamber libel cases, it hath ever been agreed, it is not the matter, it's not the content of the libel that we're interested in, but the manner which is punishable. And by that he means the form in which it's written, the verse, song, plays, and the ways in which it's published and made public, the ways in which it's communicated. So this is great for literary scholars because it means that the Star Chamber is interested in how these libels were composed, how they were communicated, how they were copied out and circulated. They are interested in the form, the manner, be it verse, drama, image, and print. It also, I think, gives us a unique insight into the lives of people across the social scale in the period. And this period, so the early 1600s, is directly before the English Civil War, that saw the execution of a monarch and the installation of parliamentary rule. It's also been reflected that the late 16th and early 17th centuries were the most litigious age in English history. I think that is something that we sometimes forget. Litigation, going to law, being involved in legal cases was nearly an everyday occurrence for people in the early modern period in a way that I don't think it is for us, thankfully. And scholars have seen this litigiousness as leading to what they call law-mindedness across the social scale. I recently interviewed Jonathan Healy, the author of a new kind of history of the Civil War period, Civil War England, and he reflected that he thinks this law-mindedness was actually a kind of key factor in increased political engagement across all social scales, that we can see in some ways as a kind of precursor to, or the conditions for, fomenting something like a civil war, where people, the kind of popular political engagement is one of the key distinctive factors. In fact, a pamphlet writer in the 1580s said that libels and the like were a marker of the ship of Commonwealth being overladen with sin and iniquity. And he reflected that it was likely that they would be shipwrecked and overwhelmed anytime soon. He was not wrong. Okay. So I just then finally wanted to sketch some of the temporal doubleness of this phenomenon as both part of a long-standing medieval dramatic culture of insult and a uniquely early modern kind of multimedia and news-like form. One example of this is the alignment of libelers, or libels, with the medieval morality play vice character called Backbiter. So Backbiter, in the early medieval morality play tradition, was the devil's messenger. He was a news teller. He brought a box of proclamations and news with him when he came on stage. And he was said to speak fair before and foul behind. So flatter you to your face, but speak terribly about you behind your back. He, as a character, Backbiter, was associated with Fortune's wheel because he was seen as levelling social hierarchies. And he was seen as the most pervasive social ill for destroying communal harmony. Morality plays are interested in that kind of communal harmony in a really interesting way. But Backbiter as a figure in drama was also morally ambiguous because he was indiscriminate in his targets. He could target the vice characters as much as he could target the virtue characters. In one famous example, he tells the devil, he tells on some of the minor vices to the devil and gets them beaten. So he is kind of morally ambiguous, even though he is aligned with the evil vice side of things. And interestingly, he is the vice character who most often remains unpunished at the end of plays. Most of the time, all of the other vice characters get punished. Some of them even get kind of hanged on stage. But Backbiter gets away with things. In one example, he is even the hangman for some of the other vices. He escapes from the play world then because he persists in the real world. So it's therefore fitting, I think, really interestingly, that in the slightly later period of early modern England, the pervasive social practice of libeling seems to be a kind of weird reincarnation or persistence of this figure, this kind of social ill. And in 1607, Richard West's text, A Court of Conscience, could describe the libeller as Backbiter, the first amongst the vicious livers of the age, called for punishment in the Court of Conscience. He's referred to as Master Silkstrings, the bawdy emblem maker, rhymer and riddler, who spends all the whole day in ribald talk and loathsome filthy rhymes, backbiting all men in a hidden sort, inventing bawdy ballads and giving quips and railing nips. We see a backbiter-like element in another libelous play that occurred in Lincolnshire, and this 1601 case, the locals libelled the Earl of Lincoln. Talboys Dimmock, the principal actor, did first counterfeit and took upon him to represent the person of the Earl of Lincoln and his speeches and gesture. So he's impersonating the Earl on stage as part of their summer play. As an actor representing the Earl of Lincoln in the said play, he was there fetched away by Roger Bayard, who acted and represented the person and place of the devil. So they impersonate the Earl in a kind of morality type play, and he's also carried off by the devil at the end in a kind of backbiter-esque form. But finally, for all their uses of earlier theatrical traditions of vice and insult, libels were a really distinctive feature of the early modern periods, proliferating news, disinformation-filled public sphere. So my final example is a case where the libellers, who were a gentleman and a group of friends, launched a two-prong attack on one Mr. Weckham, a merchant of Netherstowe in Somerset. First of all, they got two vagrants to make a mock royal proclamation, the standing at the market cross going, "Oh yay, oh yay," on a market day, a public, busy market day, to call Weckham a peddler rather than a merchant, and to performatively associate him with low-life vagrancy. The use of vagrants to make this mock proclamation plays on a really pervasive social anxiety for the period around vagrancy and vagabonds. And vagrants were often also always related to the dangers of spreading false information because they had a kind of mobility, false news. The royal proclamation is also the key method for publicly declaring new statutes, so it is a kind of news media for the day, so they're also kind of inserting it into the early modern period's news scene by having it as a mock proclamation. And I said a two-pronged attack, so their second aspect of this case is that they wrote a libelous letter and they made a book out of 4 knaves of playing cards sewn together to accompany the letter, which they called the Book of the Peddler's Profession, telling Weckham that he should keep the Book of the Peddler's Profession in his pocket with his fake arms of gentility. In doing so, they invoked contemporary satires. You can see the front pages of this contemporary printed satire around the knaves of playing cards, which represented social stereotypes like the knave of clubs for a quarreller and so on. So this indicates the kind of multimedia intertextuality typical of this kind of libeling culture that is topical and ephemeral and kind of thinking of itself in a disinformation, kind of false news type of a way. Okay, I'm going to leave the last word on the dangers of libeling to our good friend Shakespeare. In his play Measure for Measure, performed before King James at court on the 26th of December in 1604, the Duke, who is suffering from a similar popular critique by his subjects, reflects, "No might nor greatness in mortality can censure escape. Back wounding calumny the whitest virtue strikes. What king so strong can tie the Gaul up in a slanderous tongue?" Thank you.